Right. Let's dive straight into something I know I've scratched my head about, and I bet a lot of you have too. Socialism and communism.
Hmm.
They pop up constantly in discussions, right? And often they're used almost interchangeably.
They really are. It's a common point of confusion.
But you got to wonder, what are the real fundamental differences, especially when you're looking to, cut through the noise and get a solid understanding quickly, if possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that blurring of the lines is widespread. That's precisely what we're aiming to unpack today.
Okay, good. So our mission in this deep dive is pretty simple. Clarity. Clarity on socialism and communism. We've got a great source to help us, an article by Aidan Javaharian called, basically, The Difference Between Socialism and Communism.
Published May 16th, 2025.
Exactly. And Javaharian really tackles this confusion head on, especially thinking about how it's understood or misunderstood among Iranians. But the points are universal. The goal is a robust picture of how these two systems compare.
Yeah, and what's immediately striking, reading Javaharian, is the shared origin he highlights.
Okay.
Both socialism and communism, they fundamentally arose from looking critically at capitalism.
Right. The problems it created.
Exactly, social inequalities, that kind of thing. So they start from a similar place, this critique, but the paths they propose, they diverge quite dramatically when you look at the solutions and the ultimate visions.
Okay, that shared starting point is interesting. It explains some of the confusion, maybe. So let's get down to brass tacks. When we talk about socialism, what are the key characteristics we should have in mind?
Well, at its heart, socialism is really a political and economic framework. It's centered on pursuing greater social equality.
Equality is key.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It generally advocates for public ownership or, importantly, democratic control over the key resources and means of production.
So who owns the factories, the land?
It's about shifting that control, often towards the public or workers. Think of it as a system where social justice and a more equitable distribution of wealth are paramount. The state often plays a significant regulatory role in the economy to try and achieve those aims.
Okay, state involvement.
But what's fascinating, and Javaharian points this out, is the variety within socialism itself.
Right, it's not just one single thing, is it?
Not at all. There are different forms. You've got democratic socialism, which operates firmly within a framework of parliamentary democracy.
Like elections, civil rights.
Exactly. And then things like market socialism, which tries to integrate market mechanisms, supply and demand, but with state oversight or social ownership.
Interesting. Does Javaharian give examples?
He does, and it's a compelling one.
Mm.
Scandinavian countries, places like Sweden and Norway.
Ah, yes. Often held up as examples.
Right. They've managed to establish these really robust welfare states, achieved high levels of social equality, but they've largely maintained a capitalist economic system underneath it all.
So it shows how socialism, or at least social democracy, can function as a modification, maybe a tempering of capitalism.
Precisely. It's about adjusting the existing economic order, using its productive capacity, but steering it towards social goals, rather than demanding a complete overhaul.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how does communism fundamentally differ from that basic socialist idea? Because it sounds like it starts from a similar place but goes further.
It goes much further. Communism, in contrast, is a socioeconomic system that envisions the complete absence of private ownership of the means of production.
No private factories, no private land used for big business.
Correct. The core idea is that all resources are collectively owned by society as a whole. The ultimate goal here isn't just regulating private property, it's the abolition of private property entirely.
Wow, okay.
Leading to, theoretically, a truly classless society, and eventually even the disappearance of the state itself.
The state disappears.
Well, the idea, particularly in Marxist theory, is that the state is a tool of class oppression. Once classes are gone, the state becomes unnecessary. This might potentially involve revolutionary means to get there. It's a much more transformative, radical vision.
That sounds like a completely different ballgame, as you said. So is communism almost seen as the ultimate endpoint of a particular ideological journey, starting perhaps from socialism?
Exactly. In classical Marxist theory, communism is often conceptualized as the final stage of societal evolution.
The end goal.
The end goal, where humanity is entirely free from the perceived limitations, the injustices of capitalism. However, and this is crucial, as Javaharian emphasizes, the historical attempts to realize this ideal.
Like the Soviet Union, China.
Precisely. Those attempts encountered some really significant and frankly often brutal challenges, well-documented problems.
Understatement of the year, perhaps. Okay, so we're starting to get a clearer picture of the distinction. Let's really break down those core differences, maybe point by point, based on Javaharian's analysis. First up, ownership and economic control. How do they stack up?
This is absolutely critical. Socialism generally involves public ownership or democratic control of production. But, and this is key, it often still allows for private ownership to exist in many sectors.
So you could still own a small business, maybe?
Often, yes. The aim is more about finding a balance, preventing the kind of extreme inequalities that can arise in totally unregulated capitalism. Javaharian frames it as a movement to reform capitalism. He even suggests it can evolve into forms very close to capitalism itself, like social democracy.
Okay, so socialism is about regulation, balance, maybe public ownership of key strategic things, but not necessarily everything. And communism.
Communism takes that radically different stance. It calls for the complete abolition of private property. All resources, all means of production are to be under collective ownership.
No.
In the ideal theory, no. The objective isn't to reform capitalism, it's to completely dismantle and replace it.
Got it. One's about tweaking the system, maybe significantly, the other about replacing it entirely. Now, what about the role of the state? You mentioned it might disappear under communism, but what's its role within each system before that point?
Okay, so under socialism, the state generally plays a very active and significant role.
It's a major player.
A major player. It's seen as a crucial instrument for regulating and managing the economy, for ensuring a more equitable distribution of resources. And importantly, this usually happens within a framework of parliamentary democracy and established civil institutions.
So using the democratic state to achieve socialist goals.
Exactly. The state is intentionally used as a tool to bring about social equality through gradual, often legislative means. Change through the system.
Okay. So the state is central to guiding and shaping the economy and society in socialism. What about the state in communist theory before it supposedly withers away?
In communist theory, the state, especially during the transition phase, often called the dictatorship of the proletariat, is viewed as a temporary necessity.
Temporary, but potentially powerful.
Very powerful, yes. A tool needed to suppress the old ruling classes and reorganize society. But fundamentally, it's seen as an instrument that will eventually become obsolete and wither away once a truly classless society is achieved.
So its long-term goal is its own obsolescence.
Precisely. And this really highlights the revolutionary nature often associated with communism. It's not just about transforming the economy. It's about a fundamental reshaping of society, potentially overturning existing political structures, and ultimately moving beyond the need for traditional governing structures as we understand them.
That's a massive difference in vision for the state itself. Okay, next up, society and social classes. How do the two ideologies view these?
Socialism definitely aims to significantly reduce the deep inequalities between social classes. It wants to foster a much more equitable society.
Reduce the gap.
Reduce the gap, yes. However, it generally acknowledges that some level of class differentiation, or at least economic variation, might still exist. The focus is more on creating a society where everyone has genuinely more equal opportunities for advancement, a decent standard of living, a safety net.
So it's about creating a fairer system, mitigating the worst aspects of class division, but maybe not eliminating class entirely. And communism.
Communism has that much more radical goal, the establishment of a completely classless society.
No classes at all.
That's the ideal. The core idea is that all members of society participate equally in both the production and consumption of goods and services. This would, in theory, eliminate any hierarchical social structures based on economic ownership or position.
That sounds, well, truly utopian almost.
It is a utopian vision in many respects.
Finally, on these core differences, how do these ideologies propose to actually achieve these societal structures? What are the envisioned methods of implementation?
This is another major point of divergence. Socialism typically advocates for gradual and democratic reforms.
Working within the system.
Exactly. It's about working within existing legal and political systems, using elections, legislation, public participation to bring about change. It emphasizes peaceful and evolutionary methods of transformation.
Change through established political processes. And communism.
Communism, historically and theoretically, has often been envisioned as the outcome of a proletarian revolution.
Oh, revolution.
Yes, a forceful overthrow of the existing capitalist order by the working class. The emphasis is often on radical, even violent revolutionary action as the necessary means to achieve that fundamental societal shift.
Okay, these distinctions, ownership, state role, class vision, implementation methods, they're becoming much clearer now. But given these pretty significant differences, why, as we said at the start, is there such persistent confusion between them? Javaharian addresses this, right?
He does, and it's complex. He points to several interconnected factors. One really significant reason is that shared intellectual ancestry we mentioned earlier.
Back to the origins.
Right. Both ideologies emerged from similar critiques of 19th century industrial capitalism and the stark social inequalities it generated. Many early socialist and communist movements were closely linked, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. That historical closeness naturally contributed to a blurring of the lines in public perception.
People involved in both, maybe.
Absolutely. And Javaharian even mentions that early influential thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels sometimes used the term socialism in their earlier writings to refer to concepts that later became more closely associated with communism. That historical ambiguity adds another layer.
That makes sense. A common origin, shared thinkers, early terminology overlap. That can definitely lead to confusion down the line.
What's another key reason Javaharian points to for the overlap in understanding?
Political rhetoric, especially and unavoidably during the Cold War.
Ah, yes. West versus East.
Exactly. The terms socialism and communism were frequently used interchangeably in Western political discourse, often as a broad brush label against the Soviet bloc and its allies.
Kind of lumping them all together. Yeah. Precisely. This conflation was often a deliberate tactic, frankly, to paint any political system that wasn't staunchly capitalist with the same negative brush of communism, regardless of its actual ideological nuances or goals.
So socialist Sweden might get called communist in some circles?
It certainly happened. Javaharian notes how in the U.S. and other Western nations, communism often became this catch-all term for any political or economic system perceived as opposing free market capitalism, even if it was fundamentally socialist in its aims and democratic in its methods.
So political messaging definitely muddied the waters for a lot of people. What else contributes to this mix-up, according to the article?
Well, alongside the history and the politics, there's simply a lack of detailed public understanding. These are complex ideologies.
Definitely not simple.
And the nuances, the subtle but important differences, are often lost in translation or oversimplified in popular discussion. So, because the fundamental principles and the historical developments aren't always fully grasped, many people just tend to group them together.
What kind of misconceptions arise from that?
Well, there's often a widespread misconception, for instance, that socialism is inherently anti-democratic or can't function alongside capitalism, which, as the Scandinavian example shows, isn't necessarily true for democratic socialism.
Right.
And conversely, communism is frequently seen merely as a more extreme version of socialism, rather than a distinct ideology aiming to fundamentally overturn democratic systems and the very concept of private property as prerequisites for its final stage.
That lack of nuanced understanding is certainly fertile ground for confusion. And finally, Javaharian touches on how actual historical experiences contribute to the problem. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, this is about how countries identify themselves versus what they actually did. Several nations, most notably the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, officially declared themselves communist states, aiming for that communist future. But in practice, especially economically, they implemented policies and systems that contained significant socialist elements: state ownership, central planning, social welfare programs. This real-world blending of ideas and terminology, where a state calls itself communist but uses socialist tools, naturally contributed to the mistaken belief that the terms were interchangeable for many observers.
So the label didn't always match the practice perfectly.
Exactly. As Javaharian points out, the Soviet Union, while proclaiming its communist ideology, implemented extensive state planning and social programs that look very much like core socialist principles in action.
So the actual implementation didn't always neatly fit the theoretical boxes, leading to further blurring of the lines in public perception. Okay. To really solidify these distinctions, let's maybe look a bit more closely at some of those historical examples Javaharian provides, starting with democratic socialism.
Right. As we touched on earlier, the Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they're often cited as successful examples of democratic socialism, or perhaps more accurately, social democracy in action.
What's the key takeaway from them?
What's particularly insightful, and Javaharian highlights this, is how they've managed to achieve these comprehensive welfare states. We're talking extensive social safety nets, universal health care, high-quality education, things like that.
And high taxes, usually.
And high taxes to pay for it, yes. But they achieve this alongside relatively high levels of social equality without fundamentally abandoning markets, etc.
So it demonstrates that socialism, at least in this democratic form, can coexist and function within a capitalist system.
Absolutely. It uses mechanisms like progressive taxation, strong unions, and robust social services to steer the outcomes of that capitalist engine towards creating a more equitable society. It's a hybrid model in many ways.
Right, harnessing the productivity of a market economy while ensuring a strong social safety net and reducing inequality. Now, looking at the other end of the spectrum, what can we learn from the historical examples of communism in practice? Javaharian mentions the USSR and China.
Yes, the Soviet Union and Maoist China are inevitably the key examples when discussing attempts to implement communism on a large scale. But as Javaharian stresses, it's crucial to analyze these historical experiences critically, not just take the labels at face value.
What went wrong, or differently than planned?
Well, while these states explicitly aimed to achieve the communist ideal, that classless, stateless society with collective ownership, their actual historical trajectories revealed immense challenges and significant deviations from the theory.
Such as?
In the case of the USSR, the pursuit of this ideal, particularly under Stalin and later, involved widespread political repression, the absence of democratic freedoms, and severe economic inefficiencies. Centralized planning, without market signals or competition, often led to shortages, poor quality goods, and difficulties with innovation. And despite the goal of equality, new hierarchies and forms of privilege often emerged within the party structure.
So not exactly the utopian outcome.
Far from it. And China, under Mao, experienced similar struggles, including disastrous experiments like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which caused immense suffering. Later, China underwent significant economic reforms starting in the late 1970s.
Moving towards markets.
Exactly. Introducing market-oriented mechanisms, allowing private enterprise, integrating into the global economy, all while maintaining the political control of the Communist Party. It became this unique hybrid, often described as market socialism or socialism with Chinese characteristics.
So these examples really underscore the complexities, the difficulties, and often the unintended negative consequences of attempting to implement the pure theoretical ideals of communism in the real world.
Absolutely. One key insight Javaharian implicitly draws is how the absence of functioning market mechanisms and democratic accountability in those historical communist states created fundamental problems with resource allocation, innovation, and protecting individual rights.
So the attempts to fully realize communism face some pretty significant, arguably systemic hurdles in practice. Okay, let's try and bring it all together then. Could we get just a quick, concise recap of those core differences between socialism and communism before we wrap up?
Certainly. Let's boil it down. Socialism generally aims to reform capitalism through democratic processes. The goal is greater social equality, often involving a mix of public and private ownership, and a significant role for state intervention and regulation within, typically, a democratic framework.
Okay, reform, democracy, mix of ownership, state role, and communism.
Communism, in theory, seeks a complete overthrow of capitalism, often envisioned through revolutionary means. The ultimate goal is to establish a classless, stateless society based entirely on collective ownership of all resources. The state is seen as a temporary tool that will eventually wither away.
Overthrow, revolution, classless, stateless, collective ownership. That's a really clear contrast when you put it side by side like that. And why is it so important, do you think, for us, for our listeners, to have a clear understanding of these distinctions today?
Well, I think a precise understanding is just essential for any informed political and economic analysis, isn't it?
Yeah, otherwise the conversation gets muddled.
Exactly. When socialism and communism are used interchangeably or inaccurately, it just obscures these critical differences in principles and proposed methods, and certainly in the potential societal outcomes. This lack of clarity can lead to significant misunderstandings, misinterpretations of political debates, historical movements, even current events.
Agreed. Precision matters here. So, for our final thought today, building on everything we've discussed from Javaharian's article, here's something for you, the listener, to really consider. Given these historical complexities, the vast differences between the theories and the often messy, sometimes tragic ways these ideologies have been interpreted and implemented, what fundamental principles do you believe are essential for building a truly just society in the 21st century?
That's a big question.
It is. And maybe think about how the theoretical frameworks of socialism and communism, alongside their challenging real-world applications that we've touched upon, how do they inform your understanding of that ongoing crucial crucial debate about the right balance, the balance between individual liberties, economic freedom, and collective well-being or social equality.
Finding that balance, that's the perennial challenge, isn't it?
It really is. Definitely a question worth exploring further on your own after this deep dive.